All right, let's talk about the psychological disorders chapter. Prepare you guys for the exam. Here's what you need to focus on in terms of studying. Obviously, if you've been doing the assignments, watching the videos, taking notes, you're in great shape. So, just to give you a little more of a concrete framework, make sure you study the criteria for deciding whether behavior is abnormal or not, or whether a problem is something that might need professional help as opposed to just a problem you're having with life. There's a big difference between being sad and having major depressive disorder, between being anxious and having an anxiety disorder. Okay, so we're talking about things like subjective discomfort, and which is how much it's harming you, how much you internally feel bad. Maladaptive, it prevents you from functioning and enjoying the normal things in life. And the whole idea of abnormal, unfortunately, the word has got a lot of really bad connotations, but it just means not typical. It means that what you're experiencing isn't typical of most people. Everybody gets sad. Everybody experiences sadness, but most people don't experience sadness for no apparent reason, and sadness that makes them not even want to get out of bed in the morning. Okay, that kind of a thing. So make sure you're familiar with those kinds of basic diagnostic criteria. Make sure you're familiar with the idea of cultural relativity. In other words, certain disorders are more relevant to certain cultures. For example, in the Western Hemisphere of the world, eating disorders are much more common, much more of a problem, things like anorexia and bulimia, than they are in the Eastern half of the world. And that relates directly to the ideal body image for women in the West. The West being mainly North and South America. It's very, very thin, and it's getting thinner over time. I saw one statistic recently that said that Miss America 50 years ago compared to Miss America today weighs 60% of what Miss America weighed 50 years ago. Marilyn Monroe, at her thinnest, was a size 12, and she was at that time the pinnacle of female glamour, compared to today, where models are a size 0 and a size 00 even. And if you're a size 6, you're too heavy to be a model. So other than that, make sure you guys study the different models, ways of viewing psychological disorders, biological model, cognitive model, behavioral or learning model. Each one basically sees a different contributor to causing disorders. Biological is the dominant one today. That's the medical model. It sees disorders as diseases of the brain, the organ of the brain, and obviously a lot of psychological disorders are biologically based. Schizophrenia is 100% biological. Bipolar disorder, 100% biological. So treatment for those disorders and treatment in the biological model is medicine. There's really no effective treatment for schizophrenia outside of medicine. Now, on top of medicine, there's plenty of things you could do to help, but without the medicine, forget it. Same thing for bipolar disorder. It's remarkable to see somebody with a severe bipolar disorder on and off medication. Psychodynamic is another one. Make sure you're familiar with all of those schools, all those models. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders. It's in its 5th edition, so it's DSM-5 right now. This is the manual we use to diagnose disorders. It is entirely about what symptoms, what are the criteria to diagnose different disorders. There is nothing in this book about treatment. It's all about making a diagnosis, and it allows professionals, mental health professionals, to communicate very easily about patients because we're all using the same language and the same book to diagnose from. Now, it's obviously an imperfect book. It's revised every few years to make it better. It was just revised a couple years ago. Usually it goes about 10 years before you have a major revision. And when it's revised, certain things are taken out and certain things are added. For example, homosexuality used to be a diagnosable psychological disorder in the DSM. In fact, over 100 years ago, there was a disorder called drapetomania, where slaves that wanted to be free were diagnosed as having a disorder, which was an inordinate desire for freedom. So it's as much a reflection of society as it is science. So make sure you're just familiar with that in terms of its properties and what the DSM means to us. The DSM is a multi-axis system. Axis 1 through 5. Axis 1 has all the clinical syndromes. These are the most biologically based, most chronic problems. Axis 2 are personality disorders. Personality disorders are where your personality is so extreme and so rigid that in and of itself, it is a disorder. It doesn't allow you to function properly in a healthy manner in modern society. That's on Axis 2. Axis 3, medical conditions, medications you're taking. Axis 4, psychosocial, which, what are the stressors? What are the environmental situations in your life that are either stressors or benefits, supports, strengths? Are you employed or not? Are you in a relationship or not? Do you have a loving family or not? That kind of stuff. Did you just get divorced? Did you just lose your job, etc.? In terms of prevalence of disorders, the most common group of disorders that are diagnosed are anxiety disorders. There's no doubt about that. About 18% of population at any given time suffers from an anxiety disorder, and there are several of them, as you guys, I'm sure, have read and watched the videos. The most common single disorder is major depressive disorder. It's about 10% of adults, which is a lot. And the most severe disorder, in general, again, there's always exceptions to the rule, but in general, the most debilitating psychological disorder is schizophrenia. And schizophrenia affects 1 out of 100 people on Earth. And that's one way you know something is biological. If you have the same rate across countries, across cultures, then it has to be biological, because environments, if it was environmental, you'd have different rates, because across cultures in the world, you have very, very different environments. Whereas with schizophrenia, no matter where you go, 1% of the population has schizophrenia. That might not sound like a lot, but if you consider the degree of debilitation involved with schizophrenia and how many people are on Earth, and 1 out of 100 have it, that's a lot of people. And by the way, the vast majority of people with schizophrenia are homeless. They aren't in treatment. That's one disorder, because it's a disorder of insight where you don't really realize something is wrong. In my career, I've treated thousands of people with schizophrenia, and I don't remember a single one of them that sought treatment on their own. In terms of anxiety disorders, make sure you're familiar with phobias. That's the most common. Panic attacks, that's the most common symptom of any anxiety disorder. And the symptoms of a panic attack are almost identical to a heart attack. I'm sure many of you have had panic attacks. Panic attacks are quite common among young adults, college-age folks. So I bet nearly half of you out there have had a panic attack, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. You have generalized anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder is the most severe anxiety disorder. An obsession is a persistent fear of something terrible happening. And then the compulsion is some ritualistic behavior you do to ward off anything bad happening. So the compulsion actually makes you feel less anxious. The most common one is germs. And folks that have the germ OCD, they're constantly washing their hands. They don't touch anything. Howie Mandel is a famous person that's quite famous for being open about his OCD. He actually built a house behind his house with his family, that when he's really being symptomatic, he goes and lives in that house by himself, and none of his kids or his wife enter that house. And obviously he can afford to do that. But sometimes he has a really hard time even being around his family. PTSD is another anxiety disorder that has to do with reliving trauma, obviously most associated with combat veterans. Affective disorders, we're talking about major depressive disorder. Make sure you're familiar with the symptoms of major depressive disorder. That's important. And bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is fluctuating between major depression and mania. Mania is being very, very high, being over energetic, in its most severe state actually being psychotic, where you lose touch with reality and you cycle between mania and depression. Talked about schizophrenia. Generally, symptoms of schizophrenia are either positive or negative. Positive symptoms are additions to normal experience, normal behavior, like hallucinations, delusions. Delusions are beliefs that have no basis in external reality. You know, the belief that I might have that somebody's following me when they aren't. A belief I might have that I have special powers. But most schizophrenic delusions are very dark, foreboding, fearful. And then hallucinations, sensory experiences with no basis in reality. I see things and people that aren't really there. I hear voices that aren't really there. And by the way, people that have hallucinations, they really see someone or something, and they really hear an audible voice. It's not like an internal belief. It's a sensory experience. Fortunately, positive symptoms are highly treatable with antipsychotic medications. Negative symptoms are an absence of normal behavior, an absence of an ability to relate to others, communicate, express ideas. In extreme forms, it could be catatonia. Unfortunately, these folks are very difficult to treat. Most of them just get worse. And most of these folks end up in 24-hour care, long-term, usually a state hospital like Warren State Hospital. One theory of what causes, we really don't know exactly what causes schizophrenia, but we know it's biological. We know about half of the cases are genetic. The other half, we aren't really sure exactly what happens, but one popular idea is that there's a decreased level of dopamine in the brain that doesn't allow the brain to function properly. We also know that folks with symptoms of schizophrenia have actually lost gray matter in their brain over time, and it disrupts the connectivity of the different parts of the brain. Then we talk about personality disorders, which I mentioned before, are when your personality itself is so rigid, so extreme that it's very dysfunctional in society. And your book talks about a couple specific ones, antisocial personality disorder, or being a sociopath, no empathy, being very manipulative, only caring about oneself, and borderline personality disorder. I did write a little bit in the website accompanying the assignment of the video on borderline, about borderline personality disorder. This is where you lack the development of any kind of self-concept. So you're craving connecting with somebody else, but at the same time, you're deathly afraid of it. So you spend your life kind of fluctuating between those two extremes. As soon as you get close to somebody, you sabotage the relationship because you can't stand closeness. But then when you're distant, you are desperate for closeness, so then you ingratiate yourself with them and become really dependent on them. These folks tend to be in very volatile relationships, relationships that can get violent. They are very frequently harming themselves, surface cutting, surface burning. Most people believe that relates to an inability to really feel emotions, feel pain on an emotional level, so they make it physical. Some folks think that they actually get high on the endorphins that are released in your brain when you inflict pain on yourself, because they are also very much usually involved in self-medicating with illicit drug use. So that should about do it. I think if you guys have been following along, as always, and you really focus on what I just talked about, you should be in great shape, for the exam on Wednesday. Again, like all exams, the exam will open at noon on Wednesday and will close at midnight on Wednesday night. Just to remind you guys, this is the last week of classes before we're off for a week. So even though we're on online class, you guys will not have any assignments for next week. Our next chapter is social psychology. I think you'll really enjoy it. Good luck on the test, and I will see you soon.